Want to welcome to the program from the blog Legal Insurrection. Professor William Jacobson is with us. Professor, how are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
I am excellent. I appreciate you coming on the program. I would like to let you know that this is a safe space for you, although we do not have glow sticks, nor do we have adult coloring books. So I apologize for our lack of activities for you. We'll just have to do this interview, unfortunately, if that's okay.
Somehow we'll survive.
So I spent the last couple of minutes going through a little bit of background about your speech at Vassar. You've spoken there before, right? Just a couple of years ago, you were a speaker there at Vassar University or Vassar College.
Yes, I spoke there in 2014, May of 2014. It was a little bit controversial, but nothing like just what happened.
Okay. Yeah, what just happened seems kind of crazy. So you were scheduled to speak, and this was all about...
I was brought to campus. I was brought to campus to talk about freedom of speech, talk about the Constitution, talk about how hate speech, quote unquote, hate speech is not actually a legal term, and how we commonly refer to hate speech is actually constitutionally protected free speech. And to talk about that issue and how campuses can handle it, given that they want to be all-inclusive, and they are private entities, Vassar, so they do have some rights to regulate speech. And that's really what I was going to talk about. And then the entire campus seems to have lost its mind and gone wild with incitement against me coming, claiming I'm bringing neo-Nazis and white supremacists with me. We're going to target students. And there was just all this horrible, horrible incitement, which got so out of hand. They actually had a meeting, like a campus-wide meeting. From the reports I've heard, someplace between 200 and 300 students, faculty, and staff got together as to how they're going to protect the campus from me and my supposed supporters. It was the most insane thing I've seen and I've personally ever experienced on a campus, as much as I've covered the campus craziness.
Okay, so I want to get into what happened before you spoke, but let's jump forward if we can, because you were able to speak at Vassar, correct?
I was able to speak under heavy security. I was invited to speak, and the event did take place. Okay.
As far as I know, I didn't read any headlines about neo-Nazis showing up at Vassar College. So was the campus a quote unquote safe space that night? There were no fights breaking out. There was nothing like that took place on campus.
Nothing. Those claims were completely fabricated, and it's worse than fabricated. They were distributed in an all-student email by the student government. And so every single student on this campus got that email and thought that I was coming to campus essentially to try to turn it into another Charlottesville, another riot. And there was never truth to it, a complete fabrication. They claimed that I was promoting this on multiple white supremacist websites, white nationalist websites. None of that is true. It was almost like an out-of-body experience or an alternate reality where you're looking at something and you're wondering, what are they talking about? Yet it was all over the campus. They were having these meetings. Apparently, faculty and staff participated in the meetings, and nobody, as far as I can tell, said to these people, you don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing here. And I know that the college did investigate these things beforehand, and they found nothing because there was nothing to find. But nobody was willing to speak truth to these students and tell them that they're fabricating things and to stop inciting what could have become a riot. It didn't become a riot. But you can imagine if you're spreading rumors that neo-Nazis are coming to campus, you could get people from the community coming onto campus, trying to pick fights, all that sort of stuff. It was an outrageous, ridiculous situation. And that's why they required such a heavy security presence. I was never on campus without at least 2, and in most cases 3 security staff with me, because the way I had been painted falsely by these student activists, I was legitimately afraid somebody was going to so-called punch a Nazi, except if they punched me, it wouldn't have been a Nazi. It would have just been someone who wants to talk about the Constitution and free speech.
Well, and see, that's the thing. I mean, again, they whip up this panic. They try, as you say, to incite, if not a riot, they try to incite fear in the students and in the faculty there at Vassar about this event that is going to take place. We talk so much about the campus carry movement on this program, Professor, and I was just reminded of, some of what we've seen and heard from professors and opponents of campus carry. Oh my gosh, if this happens, we're going to have concealed carry holders whipping out their guns in class every time somebody says something controversial. Again, it's this attempt to say something horrible could happen, and therefore we can't allow it to take place, right? So we got neo-Nazis that are, in this case, it wasn't just something horrible could happen, it's something horrible is going to happen if Professor Jacobson speaks here on campus. Meanwhile, look, it sounds like what the thrust of your speech was the Supreme Court has said that hate speech is still free speech. If you don't like speech, here's how you deal with speech that you don't like, which I think, frankly, that's a conversation we need to be having not just on college campuses, but across society right now. You can say hate speech is free speech without condoning the speech that is hateful or harmful to others. Those are two distinct and separate things.
And I tried to get that across, and I just don't think there's a segment of the student population, not the entire student population, but there's a hardcore segment that doesn't bring the values of the Constitution to the table that you and I do. They cannot understand that there are principles that protect everybody in society, and that if we don't uphold them for everybody, they'll be available eventually to nobody. And I tried to make the point to them that what you consider hateful, there are people outside the gates of this college who consider a lot of what you say hateful. Does that mean they get to shut you down? And the mere fact that you're upholding a principle does not mean you're endorsing the content of the speech. And I used the example of someone charged with murder. I asked the audience, does anybody here think someone charged with murder should not have a lawyer? And not a single hand went up. And I said, when you uphold that constitutional right, you're not endorsing the murderer and you're not endorsing murder. You're endorsing a fundamental societal protection that keeps us civilized. And but I don't know if that got through. I really don't know. We did end up getting a huge crowd. Almost 300 people spilling over into the hallways. It was a very productive lecture. So contrary to the incitement beforehand, the actual lecture itself was actually quite good. We had almost an hour and 20 minutes of question and answer. A lot of the students who came with the intention of protesting actually sat and listened and asked questions at the end. So it was a very good event, but it's just an example of how the far left sends a message to people. Why would anybody who's right of center go to a place like Vassar and be subject to the sort of abuse and defamation that I was subjected to? So it's going to scare people away. It sends a message, even though in this case, the speaker, me, actually got to speak.
Absolutely. And, for those that it doesn't scare away, I wonder if, you go then, do you end up getting speakers who go because they want the controversy? They don't necessarily want to have, as you say, that really good event where you've got a good back and forth and you're getting tough questions and you're answering those questions. I mean, that to me is what a college experience should be. When you get a chance to go and talk to somebody that you would not ordinarily get to talk to, get exposed to a viewpoint that you may or may not agree with, but you get to have that back and forth. You get to challenge the speaker. There's a way to do it that's respectful, that is polite. You can still get your point across, and you can have that challenging conversation. But it doesn't involve shouting people down. It doesn't involve not letting the speaker speak. It certainly doesn't involve getting physical with the speaker, as we have seen happen at like Middlebury with Professor Murray and the faculty member who was supposed to be interviewing him. I mean, there is a way to go about doing this, and I'm glad to know that at Vassar you were able to have that conversation. But as you say, there are people, I think not just at Vassar, but across the country at a lot of colleges and universities who don't want that conversation to take place. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that those folks who went in originally to protest and then actually ended up listening and engaging with you, they would rather of those students have just stayed away and gone coloring there in the library rather than actually listen to you, because the last thing that they want to see is that actual productive conversation happening. They don't want that. That's the opposite of what they want.
Right, because they don't have the confidence that they'll win the argument. That's what it gets down to. And so it's same with Second Amendment. It's same with so many different of our liberties. They don't have the confidence of their argument. They're afraid they'll be embarrassed and lose. And I wish they had shown up, the hardcore people. And I wish they had asked questions. And I wish I had been able to have, in a sense, a mini debate with them in front of the crowd, because I'm confident of my positions. They're not confident of their positions. A lot of time, their knowledge of the subject matter is an inch deep and a mile wide. And they have the talking points and they have the bullet points, but they can't really engage in an extended discussion. And I think that's what they were afraid of. I will say, by contrast, the students who for an hour and 20 minutes asked questions, they were very good questions. They didn't necessarily agree with me. I'd say most of them didn't agree with me, but they approached it from a different angle than I would have, because they've been raised in this whole social justice theology, is what I call it. And that's okay that they expressed that to me. And we had a good back and forth, and I explained why that, the history of the First Amendment in many ways is the history of protecting so-called progressive movements, the civil rights movement. If it wasn't for our First Amendment, we never would have had a civil rights movement. So I tried to dig back into history for them and explain to them that they are being very short-sighted by taking the position that just because they control this campus, that they should have the right to shut down speech, because that's not the history of it. That's not the rest of society. And I did make the point that I guarantee you almost everybody in the room, almost 300 people, could not believe it when Donald Trump won. And that's because they live in a bubble. They think that the Vassar campus, and it's true at many campuses, is the entirety of the country. And they don't hear pushback. They don't hear alternative views. And that does them a great disservice. And so I really urge them to, meet speech that they don't like with more speech, not by silencing people.
Absolutely. And, when you talk about the history of First Amendment jurisprudence in this country, that to me, that's a conversation that should sway some of those protesters to your side, because as you say, as the Supreme Court was first starting to develop, its First Amendment case law, it wasn't out there defending, speech by conservatives or Republicans. I mean, we're talking about attempts to silence largely people on the left, right? And it was because of the Constitution, because of our First Amendment, that frankly the progressive movement in this country was able to do what it did, what socialists, what even communists were able to publicly put out and print and distribute here in the United States, ideas that were completely antithetical to the Constitution, still protected by the First Amendment.
That's right. And I made that point to them that, that is the history of the First Amendment, that unfortunately all the headlines get grabbed by the neo-Nazis marching through Skokie when I was growing up, and the people in Charlottesville and the Westboro Baptist Church. But that's not the majority of First Amendment cases. That's not really the history of First Amendment cases, that it is protecting the people who are out of power. And that's what they don't understand. Because they are so empowered on campus, they believe it's always going to be that way. And they just got to understand that not to live in the moment, that there's a sweep of history for protection of free speech. And I made the point to them also, when I was growing up, and maybe it's generational, that campuses were considered the most free speech places in the country. And now they're the least free speech places in the country. And why should that be? If you want all the protections of the Constitution when you're on campus, you don't want unreasonable search and seizure. You don't want to be compelled to testify against yourself. All these other things. I even used the example of the Third Amendment, which nobody in the room really knew, which is that the government can't quarter soldiers in your house in time of peace. I said, do you want the government putting soldiers in your dorm room? No, of course not. I said, so if you want all these constitutional protections on campus that you have off campus, why is it that the only one you don't want is free speech? Does that make any sense? And I think I made progress. I'm not going to say I changed hundreds of minds in one speech, but that wasn't really the goal. The goal was to get students thinking that this isn't just a social justice issue. It's a protection of society, which indirectly protects the things that they like politically.
Absolutely. And, what a great point you made, talking again about, well, look here on Vassar, you may be the majority, but it's not about just protecting the majority, right? In fact, I mean, that's one of the safeguards of the Constitution, is protecting the rights of minorities in this country, those who have minority opinions, minority religious beliefs. It's not just that majority rules in this country. And the fact that, you've got that line of thinking, well, the majority should rule. Here's the thing. I think that is a very illiberal position to hold. And I'm sure that a lot of these folks would call themselves proud progressives, proud liberals, even though, that's kind of that's more an authoritarian tone to take, right? Well, we're the 51%, so we get to make the rules and we get to decide who can say what.
That's right. And I think they came around to understanding that, because I could dramatically point to them the fact that, once they leave the safe zone of their campus, they're in the real world, and they have to deal with people who disagree with them, and they have to deal with people whose opinions may offend them. But one thing that did surprise me a little, not that I was completely taken aback, but the students have been raised to believe that their personal feelings are what can drive things. And if they find speech dehumanizing or humiliating, that's actually a standard by which to shut other people down. And I tried to explain to them that we can't use that as a test, because two people hearing the same language could have two very different reactions to it. So you can't, and the courts never have used that subjective emotional reaction to offensive speech as the basis for, interpreting the First Amendment. It's an unworkable solution. And it also, of course, would expose them to people who find their speech humiliating and demeaning. And, I used one of the examples. One student had asked me, well, isn't it one particular demographic who's doing most of this hate speech, et cetera? And I said, well, I don't know what demographic you're talking about. I said that kind of tongue in cheek. And she goes, white males. I said, it's very interesting, because there's a student who's being punished now in Canada for making derogatory comments about white males. If you said that in Canada, you would be subject to their hate speech laws. Is that really what you want? That you wouldn't be able to speak like that? And so, but their feelings drive everything. Their social justice views drive everything. But I do think with all that baggage, they still can learn and understand that it's not as simple as they've been led to believe.
Absolutely. William Jacobson with Legal Insurrection. Listen, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's good talking with you today.
Great talking to you.
And we look forward to doing this again at some point in the near future. LegalInsurrection.com, and you can find Professor Jacobson on Twitter at LEG Insurrection.